The Obsidian Rose isn't just a restaurant, it's a fortress. Standing tall in the heart of the city, with its polished black marble architecture and sky-reflecting glass panels, it's the ultimate symbol of exclusivity. Stepping through its gleaming mahogany revolving doors, you're immediately drawn into a world woven from unspoken rules, where every movement, every glance holds its own meaning. The gentle clink of crystal glasses, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on meticulously groomed faces, and the lingering strains of jazz from a piano tucked away in a corner create a perfect tableau of luxury. Yet beneath this opulent facade lies an invisible tension, a whispered hint of unseen boundaries that only those who belong truly perceive. The philosophy of the Obsidian Rose has always revolved around hidden perfection, prioritizing discreet service and privacy, still for Dr. Naomi Hayes. She understood this was merely a sophisticated veneer for a form of discrimination, even more refined than the diamonds the elite flaunted. Dr. Naomi Hayes was a woman who didn't need to flaunt anything. She was a seasoned professor at the prestigious Crestwood University, a brilliant scholar with the soul of a quiet activist. She carried the heavy yet proud legacy of generations who had tirelessly fought for their place, for their voices to be heard. This forged in her an ironclad self-respect and an unshakable resolve. It also made her more sensitive than ever to even the smallest signs of exclusion, the cold, scrutinizing glances or seemingly harmless words that concealed prejudice. A typical day for Naomi unfolded within the book-lined walls of her university office, where the scent of old paper and ink seemed to permeate her every thought. She passionately imparted knowledge on ethics and justice to her students, believing that education was the path to true liberation. Her world was a space of open inquiry, vibrant debates, and a ceaseless search for truth. It was a complete contrast to the confined, prejudiced world of the elite she was about to enter. Sometimes after a long lecture, Naomi would close her eyes, take a deep breath, and wonder if the values she believed in would ever truly be respected in every corner of society. Her relationship with Ethan Carter, her husband, was a testament to the harmony between two seemingly opposing worlds. Ethan, a private billionaire, embodied economic power, while Naomi embodied intellectual power. Their love wasn't just passion. It was deep respect and a silent strategic alliance. They understood each other without words, a bond forged over many years. A few weeks prior, during a quiet dinner at home, Ethan had casually mentioned an invitation to the Miller family's daughter's birthday party, an influential family he was collaborating with on a major project. "They invited us," he said, eyes still fixed on his steak. "I accepted for both of us. Table 7 by the garden window." Naomi, sipping her red wine, raised an eyebrow slightly. She knew these parties always came with their own rules of engagement. "Is that okay, hun?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Ethan set down his silverware, looked directly into her eyes, a warm smile gracing his lips. "You'll be fine. I've got everything handled." His gaze was filled with understanding, reassuring her that she didn't need to worry about the unspoken rules or scrutinizing looks. He trusted her autonomy, but subtly promised to always have her back. The official invitation arrived a few days later, a thick envelope made of premium ivory paper with intricately embossed gold designs. Naomi held it in her hand, feeling its weight. Not anticipation, but a familiar hint of the times she had felt she didn't belong in similar spaces. She recalled stories from her grandmother about restaurants where people of color weren't allowed through the front door or were seated in the most obscure corners. Although times had changed, the ghosts of prejudice still lingered. Naomi decided to arrive early alone. She wanted to face the place on her own terms, as herself, without relying on Ethan's powerful presence. This was a silent declaration of her independence. She chose a simple, flowing white silk dress that gracefully hugged her body without being ostentatious. No glittering jewelry, No designer handbag, no expensive high heels. Just sheer elegance and clear intention. Her naturally curly hair was pulled back into a neat low bun, highlighting the delicate contours of her face. Her presence alone would speak volumes. The Uber pulled up to the polished entrance of the Obsidian Rose just after 3 p.m. Midday sunlight hit the restaurant's glass and chrome facade, creating reflections that made it look like a temple of modern privilege. The valet in a crisp charcoal uniform opened the door for Naomi, his eyes sweeping over her for just a moment. Not hostile, but that default scan, the calculating glance that assessed whether someone fit in. Naomi stepped out, her chin slightly raised. Each step was composed, unwavering, as if she had anticipated that scrutinizing gaze and chosen to disregard it. Inside the space was as lavish as rumored. The marble floor gleamed like a mirror beneath her sandals, while a colossal chandelier resembling a frozen fireworks display hung suspended from the ceiling, casting a warm, flattering light on the carefully curated crowd. The scent of truffles and chilled champagne wafted through the air, subtle yet proudly present. This was a perfectly orchestrated world, where everything from the decor to the aroma was meticulously calculated to create a sense of superiority. Naomi felt the familiar constriction. It wasn't an outright discomfort, but a lingering sensation, as if the air here was too thick with pretense and judgment. Naomi approached the reception stand where a young blonde woman with a tight bun and an equally tight smile stood. Her name tag read Chloe. Naomi offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon. There's a birthday party for Madison Miller, and I believe my name should be on the guest list. Naomi Hayes." Chloe nodded perfunctorily and flipped through the leather-bound reservation book, the kind of tome that even in this digital age was retained to assert tradition. Despite everything in the room being optimized for Instagram, Chloe scanned the pages twice, then paused. She looked up, her eyes showing a hint of confusion, almost blankness. "I apologize, I don't see a reservation under that name." Naomi's smile didn't waver. She was all too familiar with similar situations, where her name sometimes mysteriously disappeared. "It should be there. My husband, Ethan Carter, confirmed it directly. We were invited by the Miller family. He even reserved a specific table, table 7, by the garden window." Chloe's lips pressed together slightly, the kind of tiny expression Naomi had seen 1,000 times before, caught between protocol and perception. The young woman leaned down to whisper to another receptionist before turning back. "Would you mind waiting for a moment? I'll have the manager assist you." Naomi stepped aside. The music and conversation around her continued as if she were invisible. She wasn't offended. Not yet. But she was taking note. 5 minutes passed, then 10. She watched other guests arrive, mostly white, all dressed in a way that exuded effortless wealth. A woman in bright red Louboutins was ushered in without question. A man in linen merely nodded to the staff and was led to a private lounge. Naomi felt a familiar unease rise like a cold wave creeping up her spine. This wasn't anger, but a deep disappointment. She had prepared for this, but its repetition still wearied her. "Be patient, Naomi," she told herself. "Self-respect isn't about yelling." Then from across the room, a tall woman in an emerald silk dress swept in like a storm wrapped in satin. Blonde, tanned, and radiating confidence, she glided swiftly toward the reception desk. Chloe immediately straightened up. "Ms. Sinclair, welcome. We have your favorite table ready. Table 7. Naomi's heart pounded. She turned back to the receptionist. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice level, "but that's the table my husband reserved for me." Chloe blinked, her face now unreadable. "I'm sorry, madam. There must be some confusion. Ms. Sinclair is a regular guest here. That table has been reserved for her for weeks." Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly, as Victoria Sinclair, with her familiar sneer, glanced at Naomi. Victoria's eyes swept over Naomi dismissively, almost evaluatively, as if she were wondering if Naomi was a misplaced cleaning staff member. Just then, Marcus Thorne approached behind Chloe. He was a man in his 40s, with slicked back hair and a tailored navy suit. He cast a glance at Naomi, his eyes lingering slightly, not quite disdainful, but full of assessment, as if she were an unexpected glitch in his tightly controlled system. "I apologize," Marcus said with a half-smile, a smile Naomi knew well was a mask for arrogance. "But that table is no longer available. We can arrange for you to sit near the kitchen. It's quieter there." Naomi's spine straightened like a sword. Her voice when she spoke was soft but sharp as a knife. "Are you suggesting I sit near the kitchen while someone else occupies the table reserved under my name?" Marcus shrugged. "We do our best to accommodate our guests, but sometimes there are mix-ups." The implication was unmistakable. In his world, she was the mix-up. Naomi looked around the lobby once more. No sign of Ethan, no allies. She clenched her hands at her sides, not in anger, but in restraint. She was a guest in a place her husband had helped build, yet she was being treated like an error in the system. A surge of mixed emotions rose within her: indignation at the insult, frustration at the repetition of an old script, and a profound weariness from always having to fight for recognition. She recalled stories of her grandmother, who was once refused service at a diner just because of the color of her skin. This wasn't just a table. This was a denial of her identity, her worth, and her legacy. And just as she opened her mouth to retort, just as Marcus gestured to a security guard, with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he could handle any situation like this, the gentle rumble of an electric engine echoed from outside the restaurant, soft, elegant, and unlike any car the valet had handled that day. The doors opened again, everyone turned their heads, and the atmosphere in the Obsidian Rose began to shift. The hum of the electric engine faded as the main doors of the Obsidian Rose slid open with mechanical perfection, revealing the man who had just exited the limited edition Koenigsegg Gemera parked at the curb. But he didn't walk in with swagger or ostentation. No, Ethan Carter moved with the controlled precision of a man who understood power. Not something to be displayed, but something to be felt. He wasn't dressed like the flashy elite who clung to brands as armor. Instead, he wore a charcoal gray suit tailored so immaculately it whispered of wealth without needing to shout. His skin seemed to glow under the sparkling chandeliers, and his presence appeared to fill the room before his voice even did. That was the thing about Ethan. He never had to introduce himself. The room always did it for him. But as his gaze locked onto Naomi standing near the entrance, arms crossed, jaw tight, something shifted in his expression. It was a subtle change. Just a flicker in his eyes, a slight clenching of his jaw. But it spoke volumes. He crossed the lobby with swift, measured strides, his attention singularly focused on her as if the rest of the glittering space had vanished. "Have you been standing here the whole time?" he asked, his voice low, but laced with tension. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer hung in the air between them, as palpable as the discomfort now spreading through the guests who were cautiously observing the exchange. She tilted her head toward the reception desk. "They said there was no reservation. They gave the table away." Ethan slowly turned deliberately, like a man preparing to dismantle something carefully constructed. His gaze landed on Marcus Thorne, who had instinctively taken a step back as if he could disappear into the furniture. "You gave away the table my wife reserved?" Ethan's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of expectation of quiet dominance. It made people stop mid-sentence. Marcus cleared his throat, his smile snapping back into place as a reflex. It seems there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Carter. We didn't realize this guest was your wife. And there it was, the unspoken confession embedded in that pause, this guest. The woman he assumed didn't belong. Naomi observed the moment with a strange detachment, as if watching a play she'd seen rehearsed too many times. The difference now was the stakes. The room didn't know who Ethan Carter was, not fully. Most considered him a wealthy investor, yes. But what they didn't realize was that he was the primary investor behind the Obsidian Rose, owning 58% of the shares. He had chosen to remain invisible in the operations for this very reason: to see how people behaved when they didn't know they were being watched. "You didn't realize this was my wife," Ethan repeated, as if tasting the absurdity on his tongue. "And tell me, if she wasn't my wife, would her reservation have magically reappeared?" Marcus's mouth opened, but no words came out. Chloe, the receptionist, looked down at her hands. Nearby guests shifted in their seats, unsure if they were witnessing a social faux pas or the beginning of something far more profound. "It was simply a communication misunderstanding," Marcus said, attempting to salvage what little authority had long since evaporated. "We had a last-minute request from a valued client." "Which client?" Ethan asked. He already knew the answer, but the question was a blade. Marcus hesitated. "Ms. Sinclair." "Victoria Sinclair," Naomi said softly. "The same woman who's attended 3 diversity conferences this year and still looks at me like I'm the cleaning staff." The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched slightly, but he didn't look at her. Instead, he stepped forward toward Marcus, who instinctively recoiled half a step. "You gave away my wife's pre-booked table to a woman who had no reservation." Ethan's voice was now razor sharp. "Simply because she looked like your version of a VIP guest. And then you offered my wife a seat near the kitchen, as if she were lucky to even be allowed in." A silence enveloped them like a fog. Even the pianist had reduced their melody to a vague, cautious hum. The air in the restaurant was no longer one of indulgence and champagne sparkle. It became fragile, precarious, as if everyone was suddenly aware of the thinness of politeness when class and color collided. Marcus tried again, his smile now rigid, his forehead dotted with sweat. "Mr. Carter, of course, if we had known." "You don't need to know," Ethan cut him off. "You simply need to respect the reservation, the name, and the person standing in front of you." And then, for the first time since he appeared, Ethan turned toward the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound a table. But somehow, everyone leaned forward. "This is precisely why I've remained behind the scenes," he said, "to see how this place truly operates. I've heard the whispers, seen the patterns. But today, you've given me proof. You assumed my wife didn't belong here because she arrived without glittering gowns or European arrogance. You made a judgment, and you buried her name under your prejudice." Victoria Sinclair, now seated at table number 7, with a crystal glass in her hand, lifted her chin and offered a sarcastic smile that barely concealed her discomfort. "This is getting rather dramatic," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, attempting to force a laugh. "I'm sure we can all act like adults about this." Ethan didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on Marcus, who looked as if he were melting by the second. "My name," Ethan said evenly, "is Ethan Elijah Carter. I am the majority shareholder of this establishment. And the woman you just attempted to diminish is not merely my wife. She is Dr. Naomi Hayes, tenured professor at Crestwood University, published scholar, and the only person in this room who doesn't need to prove she belongs." With that, he turned to Naomi and extended his hand, not out of courtesy, but out of solidarity. Slowly, deliberately, she took it. Marcus muttered something behind them, but the moment had passed. The damage was done. And as they walked together toward the center of the room, toward the very table that had been usurped from her, Naomi didn't smile. She didn't glare. She didn't even blink as they passed Victoria, who was staring into her drink, the sparkle in her voice now duller than the melting ice in her glass. First impressions had lied. But now the truth began to resonate, and no one in that room would forget its sound. The gentle clink of crystal and the soft strains of jazz resumed as Ethan and Naomi crossed the dining floor. But it was only surface noise. Beneath it, every eye in the restaurant was fixed on their every step. The velvet stillness that had fallen over the obsidian rose after Ethan's declaration hadn't lifted. It had merely shifted. Now it was the silence of restraint, of whispered judgments and sideways glances of people pretending to sip their wine, while their eyes tracked the couple like unmanned drones. Table 7. Naomi's table was by the garden window as promised in the reservation. The glass pane behind it framed the restaurant's wisteria-draped courtyard like a painting, serene and meticulously arranged. But nothing about this moment was serene. At that table, Victoria Sinclair still sat like a queen unwilling to relinquish her throne. She didn't stand up. She didn't even blink. She merely crossed her legs, swirling her drink as if the room still belonged to her. Ethan stopped directly in front of the table. His hand remained entwined with Naomi's. "Ms. Sinclair," he said coldly, "I believe you are in the wrong seat." Victoria looked up slowly, her sneer still intact, but her voice now tinged with feigned innocence. "Oh, I had no idea this table was such a point of contention. I thought it was first come, first served." She paused to sip her drink, then added, "But if it means so much to her—" "To her?" Naomi interjected sharply. "This is a matter of principle. To you, it has always been merely convenience wrapped in privilege." Naomi's voice didn't tremble. It was sharp, clear, and definitive. Each syllable was a slap to the false civility Victoria wore like a shield. A few guests near the table flinched. An elderly man in a designer shawl fully turned his chair to watch. A young couple near the bar exchanged wide-eyed glances. Victoria let out a small derisive laugh and slowly stood as if her rising was a gift to the entire room. "Well," she said, flicking at the front of her dress as if it had been tainted by Naomi's proximity. "I suppose today we are all learning to recognize our place, aren't we?" Ethan didn't reply. He simply stepped aside, held out Naomi's chair, and she sat without a word. The manager, Marcus, had reappeared by then, hovering awkwardly near a decorative pillar, his composure slowly unraveling through his cufflinks. "Mr. Carter," he said, "if I might." "You might not." Ethan cut him off without looking at him. "Not here, not now." Marcus recoiled as if slapped, swallowing whatever apology he had intended to utter, and instead turned toward the bar, signaling the head waiter with a desperate wave. The room, despite its efforts to carry on, could not escape the magnetic pull of the confrontation. Conversations now sounded stilted. Laughter seemed forced, and the waiters glided like specters, present but unsettled. Naomi, seated in the chair she deserved, observed the space with cool precision. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of appearing unfazed in rooms designed to exclude her. She knew what it meant to hold her back straight while people questioned her right to exist in a space they had claimed as their own. But this was different. This wasn't a university boardroom or a publishing house gala. This was a room full of people who thought money gave them the right to erase her. And now they were being forced to sit in the discomfort of her presence. Ethan didn't sit down. Instead, he remained standing behind her chair, his posture rigid, arms loosely crossed, watching as Marcus approached again, this time with 2 discreetly dressed security personnel beside him. The sight was enough to spark murmurs from the corners of the room. "Are you kidding me?" Naomi muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Carter, Marcus began again, feigning an authority he no longer possessed. We've received requests from another client to de-escalate. Perhaps it's best if we relocate Dr. Hayes to another area of the restaurant. Let me stop you right there, Ethan cut in. You're suggesting moving my wife because your clientele feels uncomfortable with her sitting at the very table she pre-booked. Marcus hesitated. It's purely a polite suggestion, sir. In that exact moment, something shattered. Not loudly, not overtly, but truly. Naomi rose slowly and definitively, her hands resting gently on the edge of the table. Her voice, when it came, was soft but lethal. So, to be clear, after refusing my reservation, offering me a table near the kitchen, giving my table to someone who arrived after me, and watching her openly mock me in front of your guests, you think the solution is to remove me? She looked at the two security guards, then back at Marcus. You want them to drag me out too? Because I promise you, I've weathered worse than this polite little circus. Her words reverberated sharp as smoke through silk. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably clearly, unsure whose side he should be on. Marcus blanched. Dr. Hayes, please understand. No, Ethan said, stepping closer to her. Now you understand. From this moment forward, you and I are no longer speaking as manager and investor. We are speaking as two men on opposite sides of a lawsuit. The word lawsuit seemed to echo through the crystal glasses, reverberating in the room with an electric hum. Several heads snapped around openly. Someone at a nearby table dropped a fork. Marcus took a full step back, his face twitching between panic and calculation. This isn't necessary. It became necessary the moment you attempted to erase her, Ethan said coldly. The moment your prejudice became company policy. The moment this entire establishment decided that white skin meant priority, and everything else was just a seat near the kitchen. The silence returned this time, thick with self-consciousness. No one reached for their drinks, no one spoke. Even Victoria, now seated 2 tables away, was immobile, her jaw clenched, her gaze averted. Naomi inhaled slowly and steadily, as if she were reclaiming every molecule of oxygen the room had tried to steal from her. She didn't want to cry, not because she was weak, but because this wasn't a moment for tears. This was a moment for reckoning. She sat down again this time, not just in a chair, but in a position of absolute clarity. She didn't need anyone's apology. She needed accountability. Ethan placed a hand gently on her shoulder, not in comfort, but in solidarity. Then he turned to Marcus, who looked as if he wanted to disappear into the carpet. You have 1 hour, Ethan said. Clear your schedule. We are convening an emergency board meeting. He paused. And don't you dare touch that reservation log. We already have a copy. With that, he sat down next to his wife. Their presence was now a statement in itself. The room exhaled slowly, collectively, but no one returned to normal because now everyone understood that this was not just about a table. It never had been. This was about power and who gets to decide who is worthy of sitting behind the opulent facade of the obsidian rose. Late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the parked cars, turning the luxury vehicles into sleek silhouettes against the golden glow. The air was faintly perfumed with lavender from the nearby courtyard and the citrus tang of newly uncorked champagne from within. The restaurant stood there like a fortress of exclusivity. Stone glass and silence. No one inside knew that a shift had already occurred just beyond its doors. A shift that announced itself not with sirens or spectacle, but with precision, with inevitability, and with the quiet whisper of innovation wrapped in luxury. That sound came in the form of a gentle whine, almost a hum, as a jet-black Koenigsegg Gemera sleek as a predator in the sun, rounded the corner and pulled into the private valet lane. No horn, no roaring engine, just a silent, purposeful presence, the way true power prefers to move. The valet automatically stepped forward, clipboard in hand, but stopped mid-stride as the occupant emerged. Ethan Carter, in a perfectly tailored navy three-piece suit, exited the driver's side with an almost regal composure. He wasn't rushed. He didn't scan the area like a man unsure of himself. He simply smoothed his jacket sleeve, locked the car with a flick of his wrist, and strode forward, his polished leather soles whispering on the stone. The valet nodded stiffly, almost bowing. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were already fixed on the entrance and what lay beyond it. He had received the message 20 minutes prior, a single line from Naomi. "They took my seat. I'm standing at the door." He hadn't replied. He didn't need to. His presence was the answer. As Ethan crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside shifted like a barometer before a storm. Conversations died down. Glasses clinked with hesitation. Staff stood still, and a subtle current of unease cut through the climate-controlled silence. Ethan made no eye contact with anyone as he passed the main bar, past the reception podium, where Chloe stood motionless, past Marcus, who had reappeared from a corridor, his face flushed. He saw none of them. His gaze found only one thing: Naomi, still seated at table 7, framed by the wisteria-draped window behind her chin-high face, composed, dignity unbroken. He reached her in less than 10 seconds, but the silence had stretched long before that. In those moments, people whispered names, questions passed from ear to ear, and rumors began to coalesce into reality. Ethan bent down, placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Not ostentatious, not for show, but purposeful. She reached up to touch his wrist, in return her fingers clinging. The room held its breath, watching. Then Ethan straightened slowly, rising to his full height, turning like a general surveying a battlefield he didn't choose, but would certainly finish. "Who is Marcus Thorne?" he asked, his voice low, but cutting through the stillness like a scalpel. Marcus, who had retreated behind a marble pillar, now had no choice but to step forward, clearing his throat. "I am Marcus, Mr. Carter." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Ah, so you're the one who decided to humiliate my wife in front of a room full of strangers?" Marcus hesitated, his hands clasped behind his back like a schoolboy caught in a lie. "Mr. Carter, there's been a slight misunderstanding, I assure you." "A misunderstanding when her name was in the reservation book." Ethan cut him off, one eyebrow raised. "Or did the misunderstanding only occur when a white elite woman walked through the door and you decided she looked more appropriate for the table?" The word appropriate hung in the air like a blade, daring someone to flinch. No one did. Marcus tried to speak, then swallowed. "I didn't recognize she was your wife," he said finally, weakly. "You don't need to recognize anything," Ethan said, his voice no louder but more resonant. "All you need to do is respect a reservation, respect a client, and not judge a woman based on a lack of diamonds around her neck or designer logos on her heels." The silence now was not just awkward, but heavy. People were beginning to sweat in their suits. Victoria Sinclair, seated one table away, was utterly still, her rosé untouched. She turned her face away as Ethan's gaze swept over her. "And you," he said, directing his words to her, "sat at a table with another woman's name on it, knowing perfectly well it wasn't yours." Victoria lifted her chin, summoning her characteristic smugness. "I didn't know the specifics. The staff seated me." "The staff complied with the atmosphere of the room," Ethan countered, "and that atmosphere was created by your complacency." He turned back to Marcus. "You didn't just embarrass my wife. You embarrassed my name, my investment, and this brand. You thought she was invisible because she walked in with grace instead of arrogance." And now the only thing invisible is your authority. Marcus's mouth opened and closed. A man beside him, presumably another manager, started to step forward. But Ethan held up a hand. Stop. We are not going to brush this off as a minor inconvenience. This was an act of public erasure, a choice to prioritize appearance over integrity. His voice dropped lower like thunder about to strike. But if you think this is just a social embarrassment, let me show you. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped once, and held it up. Here, he said, turning the screen to display the reservation confirmation in bold black font, is the digital proof that Table 7 was reserved under Naomi Hayes' name. Confirmed by your system, time-stamped, verified. You don't just owe her an apology. You owe her a reckoning. The declaration needed no amplification. It traveled across the marble floor and up through the polished glass, echoing in the wine glasses and bouncing off the ceiling. People didn't know where to look or how to lean in. Victoria stood up without a word and left the table, trying to maintain her grace as she did so. But everyone saw the tremor in her hand. Marcus backed away, slowly nodding as if he had just remembered. We'll rectify this, of course, he muttered. No, Marcus, Ethan said, stepping closer. I'll rectify this. And as for you, you should prepare to explain to the board of directors why this restaurant might not have a future under your management. With that, he turned, sat down next to Naomi, and finally exhaled. The Koenigsegg may have arrived without a roar, but its owner had left a dent in the room. A dent where silence had once been mistaken for weakness. The tension inside the obsidian rose didn't dissipate after Ethan sat down. It thickened like a storm refusing to break. It clung to the walls, seeped into conversations, and cast a shadow over every silver fork raised to trembling lips. Patrons tried to resume their luxurious rhythm, ordering second glasses of wine, whispering about business and charity galas. But none of it felt convincing. They were witnessing a rarely seen spectacle: power, dismantling politeness, a system cracking at its seams. Marcus Thorne, the manager who once commanded the dining floor with sleek glances and curated charm, now looked like a man walking barefoot on broken glass. He hovered at the periphery of the dining room, pretending to take calls on an earpiece, his eyes darting toward the corner where Ethan and Naomi sat. Table 7 reclaimed, redefined, and emanating a dignity no chandelier could replicate. Ethan said nothing for several minutes. He simply sipped water from his glass, his hand resting loosely on the table while Naomi sat composed beside him. Her posture unwavering, her eyes calm but burning with something deeper. Not anger. No, it was something more surgical, precision memory. A simmering fury that remembered every breath Marcus had taken from her dignity. Ethan set his glass down. We'll need the reservation log, he said without turning his head. Naomi looked up. You know they'll say it's been deleted or overwritten. He nodded. That's why I ensured IT forwarded me all the cloud syncs and internal edits from this morning. The system automatically archives every 30 minutes. His voice wasn't loud, but his words sliced through the tension like a piano wire. I want to see exactly which name was replaced and when. Marcus approached, tentative and pale. The sneer was gone, replaced by the tremor of a man who suddenly realized his position wasn't earned. It was inherited through proximity and arrogance. Mr. Carter, I'm sure we can resolve this without escalation. As I said before, this was an unfortunate oversight, not reflective of our values. Ethan slowly turned. What are your values, Marcus? The manager blinked. Sir, your values, Ethan repeated. Are they listed in your hiring manual, or are they only practiced through selective hospitality? Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a broken hinge. This isn't how we typically operate. But this is how you operate consistently. Naomi interjected, her voice sharp as a razor. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about the obsidian rows. I just never thought I'd be one of them." Before Marcus could protest, Ethan reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. "Here," he said, smoothing it on the table, "is the automated edit log generated for today's reservations." The original entry read, "Table 7 Hayes, Naomi 3:01 p.m. That entry was edited at 2:48 p.m. and replaced with Sinclair Victoria. Ethan looked up. "So tell me, Marcus, how did that happen?" Marcus stared at the paper as if it were written in a language he didn't understand. I don't recall making that change." "Of course not." Naomi said, her eyes locked on him. "Because remembering would mean taking responsibility." Marcus swallowed hard. "Perhaps Chloe, the receptionist, doesn't have administrative rights. Only management can override VIP reservations." Ethan cut in. The implications settled like ash on Marcus's lapels. The man was unraveling thread by thread, his posture shrinking under the weight of consequences he'd never imagined would find him. "Perhaps I misinterpreted instructions," Marcus said weakly, "or thought the reservation was provisional." "There were multiple confirmations," Ethan countered, tapping his finger on the paper. "Time-stamped, sent directly from your system to my assistant and forwarded to Naomi." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a soft, lethal register. "Do you know how exhausting it is to have to fight for space you've earned? To walk into rooms you've helped fund, only to be told you don't belong in them?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence was a confession. Across the room, the ripple effect of the confrontation had spread. Guests pulled out phones pretending to scroll emails while covertly snapping photos. One woman whispered to her husband and he nodded grimly. This was no longer a personal slight. It was a public reckoning, and the obsidian rose, for all its curated perfection, was starting to look like a fractured mirror. Exquisite but shattered beneath the surface. Ethan folded the reservation log and tucked it back inside his jacket. Then, with calculated calm, he picked up his phone again and pressed a button. A moment later, the restaurant's assistant general manager, an anxious-looking woman named Rachel with thick-rimmed glasses, appeared beside their table. "Rachel," Ethan said softly, "please inform the board of directors that I am convening an emergency session at 7:30 p.m. tonight. Every senior member of the staff is required to attend, including Mr. Thorne." Rachel's eyes darted between Ethan and Marcus. "Yes, sir." "And, in the meantime," he added, "I want the entire week's reservation log audited. Any edits, any deletions, any names that appear more than once or were mysteriously replaced." Marcus opened his mouth again, but Ethan raised a finger. "Don't say a word. Just prepare." Marcus retreated like a man backing away from a cliff. His departure was wordless, but no less dramatic than a scene in a courtroom drama. He had arrived that day, expecting to play the host. Now, he was a liability in his own house. As the manager disappeared behind a glass partition, Naomi finally allowed herself to exhale. Not relief, not triumph, but steadiness. She glanced at Ethan, who sat beside her with an arm casually draped over the back of her chair, his face unreadable. "You didn't have to come," she said. He turned his head. "You shouldn't have had to stand." And that was the difference. In a world that measured women like Naomi by boundaries and conditions, Ethan didn't elevate her. He acknowledged her. Her worth wasn't a debate. It was a truth. And that table, it had never been about the food. It was about a place, about being seen, about being counted. And now the restaurant would pay for its oversight. A young, nervous-looking waiter approached and set down 2 fresh glasses of water without a word. He didn't dare meet their eyes, but before he turned away, he discreetly placed a folded napkin at the corner of the table. Naomi slowly unfolded it. Inside, scrawled in looping script, were 4 words that said it all. "You were not the first." Ethan read it over her shoulder. He didn't flinch. "Then," he murmured, "it's time to make sure you're the last." As Marcus stormed out of the boardroom, the door closing behind him, like a final verdict, Ethan turned to the remaining people. "We will rebuild from here," he said. "Transparency, fairness, true accountability. That's not an option. That's the future of this brand." Robert, the older board member, finally nodded. "Agreed. It's been too long." Evelyn Reed, who had maintained an unblinking gaze, added, "It's a bold move, but a necessary one." Ethan didn't smile. He simply sat back, his gaze unwavering. "Then, we begin tonight." Outside the room, the hum of luxury and laughter continued, oblivious that the restaurant they thought they knew so well was beginning to combust from within. And from its ashes, something entirely different would rise. The morning after the boardroom reckoning, the headlines hit like a swarm of bees, fast, relentless, impossible to ignore. Exclusive, the Obsidian Rose rocked by internal scandal. Racial bias in reservation system exposed. The article had been leaked before dawn, funneled by an insider, perhaps someone who had recorded part of the board meeting. Who did it didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth was no longer contained behind closed doors. It had spilled into the public arena. And now, the Obsidian Rose's carefully polished image, once synonymous with exclusivity and high class, was being torn apart by the very people who had once lauded it. Ethan hadn't planned the press leak, but he didn't flinch when it happened. He welcomed it. What Marcus and his silent accomplices had tried to obscure with perfume and politeness was now undeniable. And when truth becomes undeniable, it becomes uncontrollable. Within 12 hours, 5 major KOLs who had tagged the restaurant on social media over the past year posted apologies for endorsing a space with roots in quiet exclusion. The Yelp page was flooded not with angry rants, but with personal stories, some calm, some devastating, all unified by a common pattern. "My father wore his best suit and was still seated at the kitchen table," one user wrote. "I always thought it was just bad luck." Another said, "Now I know it wasn't." Even worse for the board was Naomi's statement. It was posted mid-morning without fanfare on the university blog, where she was listed as a visiting lecturer in ethics. No dramatics, just a simple yet powerful declaration. When you have to fight to be seen in a place you helped finance, you begin to understand that exclusion wears many faces, some smiling, some silent. But silence is never neutral. That single quote was shared over 10,000 times within an hour. Ethan watched it all unfold from his penthouse office, looking out at the city skyline, which suddenly felt smaller. Lisa, his chief of staff, walked in with an iPad in hand and a grave expression. "We just got a call from the mayor's office," she said. "They're requesting a meeting, likely trying to contain the political fallout." Ethan nodded. "Schedule it for Friday." "Also," she continued, 3 employees from other high-end restaurants have come forward. What happened at the Obsidian Rose isn't an isolated incident. They're calling it the invisible velvet rope, quiet discrimination hidden in plain sight. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the streets below, where Teslas, taxis, and tourists passed beneath banners proclaiming the city's commitment to inclusivity. The irony was not lost on him. "Tell them I want names," he said. "If it's a system, we'll follow the network. By 3 p.m., a coalition of entrepreneurs announced the formation of a task force dedicated to auditing high-end establishments for patterns of bias in reservation service conduct incident logs. The Obsidian Rose had become the catalyst. The first stone had fallen, but now an entire industry was shaking under the pressure. At 5:45 p.m., Ethan received a call from Richard Miller, the patriarch of the Miller family and Victoria's uncle, who hadn't publicly appeared since the night she was removed from Table 7. "You've made your point." Miller's voice was smooth but sharp. "You've humiliated good people's solid businesses. Let's talk de-escalation before this turns into a crusade." Ethan replied with just 2 words, "It is a crusade." And then he hung up. Meanwhile, inside the Obsidian Rose, another transformation was underway. The entire staff had been summoned for a private meeting. No suits, no clients, just the truth. Ethan stood in the middle of the empty dining room. The tables were cleared, the lights dimmed, creating an intimate, honest atmosphere. The staff gathered: waiters, hosts, kitchen staff, cleaning crew, many of whom had been silent witnesses for years. "Some of you have seen what's been happening," Ethan began. "Some of you have lived through it, and some of you have benefited from staying silent." He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. "I'm not here to punish anyone who is afraid of losing their job. But the culture of this place ends today. From now on, you don't report to people who think image is more important than integrity. You report to leaders who know what it means to be overlooked and overqualified at the same time." A young black waiter named Isaiah raised his hand. "Can we say something safely, sir? I've been denied promotions twice. The first time I complained, I was scheduled for closing shifts for 3 months straight." Ethan looked directly at Isaiah, his gaze resolute. "Isaiah, you're safe, and as of right now, you're promoted. Head of Guest Relations, effective immediately." A collective sigh of relief seemed to deflate the room. Another hand went up, then another. Stories poured out, some whispered, some raw, all authentic. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a confessional for a workforce that had had to survive rather than thrive. And for the first time, they weren't just being heard, they were being believed. By the end of the week, Ethan had implemented an official policy across all his ventures: AI-assisted reservation monitoring to flag bias patterns, an anonymous internal reporting system, and equity-focused training with oversight from third-party ethics boards. Media called it radical. Competitors called it reckless. But clients called it right. And then, perhaps most shocking, was the call from Victoria herself. She didn't start with an apology. She started with calculation. "My family wants this to go away. We'll donate. We'll publicly support your reforms. We'll even pull out of silent investments if we have to. Just stop impacting our name." Ethan listened, then replied, "Your name isn't being dragged. It's being revealed. And perhaps it's time everyone saw what's behind that smile." She didn't answer. She just hung up. But it didn't matter. The dominoes were falling faster. Other industries, fashion, tech, publishing, began facing their own reckonings as stories from employees inspired by the fallout at the Obsidian Rose emerged. Naomi, ever the scholar, was invited to speak at a global ethics conference. She declined the podium. Instead, she submitted a paper titled Table 7, a Case Study in Quiet Power and the Geography of Disrespect. It was accepted within hours. The story had moved beyond their control, and Ethan knew it. He hadn't just disrupted a restaurant, he had broken a system. And though the path ahead would be fraught with resistance, he understood that every revolution begins with one person being told they don't belong and refusing to stand silently by the kitchen. A week later, the wisteria blossoms hanging outside the Obsidian Rose had begun to bloom again. though this time they felt less like a backdrop for opulence and more like a witness to change. The restaurant sign still stood, but the energy had shifted, subtle yet irreversible. The icy glances of exclusion, the practiced smiles that had once greeted only the right kind of clientele, were gone. In their place was something quieter, but infinitely more powerful: awareness, accountability, and a fragile hope being carefully pieced back together, like crystal glasses on linen tablecloths. That Friday afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow across the polished pavement, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. No valet rushed forward. No camera flashes flared. But for those watching, the gravity of the moment was unmistakable. Dr. Naomi Hayes had returned, not to protest, not to confront, but to dine. She stepped out wearing an ivory silk dress, her natural curls cascading over her shoulders, her warm, coppery skin luminous in the light. She wore no statement jewelry, no brand logos, no bold red lipstick to command the room's attention. She needed none of it. Her presence was its own command. Beside her, Ethan emerged from the SUV in a stone-gray suit, his hand naturally sliding into hers as they walked together toward the entrance. The very doors that had witnessed her humiliation now swung open with deference. Waiting just inside was Isaiah now, in a sleek black blazer, embroidered with the restaurant's new emblem, the head of guest relations, the man who had once asked if it was safe to speak up. His smile was different now, no longer deferential, no longer performative, just genuine. "Dr. Hayes," Isaiah said, his voice steady but respectful. "Mr. Carter, welcome back to the Obsidian Rose. Your table is ready." Naomi gave a slight nod. "Thank you, Isaiah." She didn't grandstand. She didn't need to. Every eye in the entryway followed her as she walked in. Not with curiosity this time, but with respect. Staff stood straighter, conversations hushed, and the power of her return filled the space like a tide reclaiming its shore. As she and Ethan walked through the main dining room, no one stopped them. No one tried to interject with empty apologies or rehearsed smiles. The table by the window, the infamous Table 7, stood empty, dressed in crisp white linen, soft candlelight, and a fresh bouquet of white peonies. But it was no longer just a table. It was a symbol, a chapter, a scar, a promise. Isaiah pulled out her chair. Ethan's hand rested lightly on her back as she sat. "This time," Ethan murmured, taking his seat opposite her, "you lead the conversation." She smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in contemplation. "Let's see if the room is ready to listen." Their waiter approached a young woman named Natalie, who had worked at the restaurant for over a year. She moved with a visible nervousness, but her voice carried a different cadence than before. "It's an honor to serve you both," she said, placing the menus down with care. "Chef Amari asked me to convey that tonight's menu is inspired by women who lead without having to raise their voices." Naomi raised an eyebrow, a slight curve to her lips. "Oh, that's quite a theme." Natalie blushed and nodded. "He said you'd understand." Beyond the tall windows, the city pulsed in the twilight, and for the first time Naomi felt herself relax. Not because justice was fully served, but because she had been seen, heard, and returned on her own terms. Around her, she could feel the shift in the room's gaze. People weren't looking at her with skepticism or confusion. They weren't wondering why she was here. They already knew. And more than that, they were wondering why they had never asked themselves the same question. A couple at the next table offered a respectful nod. A woman at the bar quietly said, "Thank you." Not for the drama, not for the spectacle, but for a story that had given voice to every quiet exclusion they had endured behind silk and glass and so-called sophistication. As their meal was served, dishes named after revolutionary women from across continents. Naomi leaned into conversation with Ethan, but she couldn't ignore the emotions simmering beneath her composure. Her mind replayed that first day, standing in her white dress, dismissed, her name erased. Her dignity traded for someone else's comfort. Now here she was, the same woman, the same name, the same elegance, but no longer one they could displace without consequence. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. And reclamation didn't need anger to burn. It needed presence to endure. Mid-dinner, Isaiah approached again, not with wine, but with a small black envelope. "We had this framed," he said, carefully placing it on the table. "Thought it belonged to you." Inside was a printed copy of the original reservation confirmation from that fateful day. Time-stamped, archived, and now encased in glass. Naomi stared at it for a long moment. Then, with deliberate care, she set her fork down, picked up the frame, and smiled, slowly, softly. "Proof," she whispered, "that sometimes history comes with a receipt." Ethan chuckled, raising his glass. Directed at the table, he said, "Not just this, but everything that will never be taken from someone again just because they don't fit the room." They clinked glasses, but the toast resonated far beyond their table. It was a celebration, yes, but also a declaration. Behind them, the wall that once displayed portraits of French vineyards now bore a new piece, a black and white photograph of a woman in profile. Her face turned toward the light, her posture unyielding. The plaque beneath it read, "Table 7, where elegance redefined the rules." Staff whispered about it. Guests asked who the woman was, and ownership said nothing. They didn't need to. The room already knew. And when the bill arrived, it was in a gold-embossed envelope with no total printed, just a note. "On behalf of every future patron who will never be told they don't belong, thank you." Ethan pocketed it without comment. Naomi slowly rose with quiet grace, and the room instinctively followed her. Staff adjusting their uniforms, guests turning their heads not in fear, but in reverence. She walked out the doors that had once witnessed her humiliated exit. But this time the wind was different. The city felt warmer. The flowers seemed to bloom more brightly, and her story, etched into the bones of a table once denied, was now the story of an empire forever changed. Because sometimes history doesn't happen in courtrooms or capitals. Sometimes it happens at dinner. The following Monday, a breeze swept through the city like the breath of something liberated. Something old and suffocating had finally been uprooted. The Obsidian Rose opened its doors to a new rhythm. A rhythm that polished not just the silver or recited menus in French, but measured integrity in action. The reception desk now sat behind a digital kiosk, directly linked to a cloud-based verification system. Every reservation coded, every seat change, logged, time-stamped, transparent. The hostesses, once tasked with quietly enforcing invisible boundaries, now operated with clarity. Her name was Maya, and she wore her natural curls like a crown. She had been told to smile more, dress softer, and code switch to fit the clientele. But today she stood in her navy blazer, embroidered with a gold emblem that read, "Equality is the new luxury." Inside, the layout had also shifted. Not drastically. No one moved walls, but the floor plan now focused on visibility. No more hidden tables near the service entrance. Lighting was adjusted to feel intimate, not exclusive. The menu had been rewritten not just for flavor, but for recognition. Each section carried a note. This dish is inspired by cultures whose cuisine shaped the world, but whose names were too often left off the reservation lists. It was bold and deliberate because the Obsidian Rose no longer feared discomfort. It welcomed it, made space for it, and most importantly, the people who were returning weren't the ones who had once dominated this space with their complacency. They were the ones who had long avoided it, who now entered not as exceptions, but as genuine patrons. Behind the scenes, the change was even more sweeping. The restaurant's hiring policies, once vague and prioritizing fit, had been audited and restructured with blind screenings and community outreach. Isaiah, now officially promoted to Director of Guest Experience, had implemented weekly staff dialogues, a space for complaints, suggestions, and ideas. And overseeing it all was Ethan Carter, no longer a silent investor, but an architect of a new standard. He didn't micromanage. He led with clarity, surrounded himself with voices different from his own, and kept his presence clear and accountable. His name had begun to circulate within the restaurant world, not just as a magnate, but as a disruptor. Not everyone approved, but no one could ignore him. For Naomi, her return to campus was met with quiet applause. Students who had admired her from afar now stopped her in the hallway to say, "I read the article." Or, "Thank you for speaking up when others wouldn't." She smiled gracefully, but deflected the attention because she had never intended to be a symbol of a movement. She had simply refused to disappear. Her guest lecture, originally titled Ethics in Emerging Systems, had been renamed by the university to The Geography of Power. Whose table is this anyway? Attendance tripled. She didn't tell her story until the very end. It wasn't just about a seat, she said. It was about how quickly a system will displace a person if they don't conform to the unspoken aesthetic of belonging. But what we forget is that standards aren't permanent. They are chosen, and we can choose better ones. And they did, because beyond the polished walls of the obsidian rows, other dominoes had fallen. In Seattle, a luxury spa overhauled its intake forms after a client cited a viral clip from Naomi's interview. In Atlanta, a jazz club quietly changed its dress code after facing backlash for turning away too many natural hairstyles. And in New York, a high-end hotel with a history of overbooking clients of color quietly introduced bias detection software into its reservation tools. No press releases, just a shift. Just accountability. That's how revolutions sometimes happen. Not with fire, but with form. One late evening, Ethan stood in the Obsidian Rose's liberated main dining room. The last guests had departed. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber casting shadows that looked more like stories than darkness. He traced a finger along the edge of Table 7, now permanently marked on the reservation map as Dr. Hayes' table. Not ownership, but legacy. He didn't need applause. He didn't want a plaque on the wall. He wanted this. A room where everyone knew that a seat wasn't a gift. It was a right. Naomi walked in a moment later, her heels a soft whisper on the wood floor, her expression unreadable. She moved to his side, inhaling the silence. "I thought I'd hate coming back here," she murmured. "But instead, I feel like I finally own the quiet." Ethan turned to her. "Not own," he said. "You rewrote it." They walked together to the terrace where the city's pulse still thrummed in distant traffic and echoing conversations. She leaned against the railing, the air crisp, the stars twinkling like silent witnesses above them. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. Ethan was silent for a moment. "It will evolve. Some will resist, some will perform, but enough people will remember. And that's all you need to shift an axis." A beat passed. "It started with you," he added. "A name on a log, a woman who didn't back down." She smiled. Not for him, but for herself. "I didn't need to win the argument," she said. "I just needed the room to admit it was wrong." Inside, the staff cleaned up. The new sous chef, a Vietnamese woman named Lynn, who had never felt comfortable applying to places like this until last week, left a note on the counter. Thank you for building a room that finally fits me. Naomi glanced through the window and saw it. She said nothing, but the corner of her mouth lifted. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out a new folder of documents. Proposals, expansion plans, inquiries from 3 other cities asking how to replicate the Obsidian Rose's transformation. It's starting, he said. People want the blueprint. She looked down at the documents, then up at the skyline. Then give them one, she replied. But make sure they understand that the standard isn't the table. It's the courage to stand beside it, even when they say you don't belong. As night deepened, the city began to quiet. But inside a restaurant rebuilt from legacy, from error, from fire, there stood a woman and a man by the table that had once tried to erase her. Not in triumph, but in vindication. And beyond that glass, the world, watching, listening, learning, began to draw its lines not around who belonged, but around what would no longer be tolerated. Because from that night forward, the standard had changed, and it bore her name.